Good morning from me and good morning from Liane Davey. How are you doing, Liane? Good morning.
I'm well, thanks. Good morning, Rachel.
Excellent. So welcome, everybody. We are literally living and learning as we go. So there is my microphone, which I'm trying to get into the screen as well. Welcome to Better, Smarter Learning, which is sponsored by Passion Toolset, and very much we are very excited. We're joined by Liane Davey here today, and thank you to, we've got 4 people on the line as well, so I don't know whether you want to type some comments, but we are literally live streaming with 4 other viewers. So hi and welcome, and thank you for registering for Better Smarter Learning here today with Liane Davey and sponsored by Passion Toolset. And just quickly to say thank you to the sponsor, Passion Toolset. My microphone doesn't seem to be behaving itself, but Passion Toolset is for initiative fatigue for coaches, leaders and learning students, and it permanently shifts your mental blocks by daily behavioral 5-minute tasks to increase your higher performing behavior. So thank you for the sponsor. And now to get into our talk with Liane. So Liane, you're joining us from Canada, am I right?
Yes, I'm in Toronto.
Toronto, lovely. And I first heard about you because you were writing for the Harvard Business Review, which I understand you've done 44 articles and counting, but more so, you are a New York Times bestseller, and 2 books now. The first book is You First, Inspire Your Team to Grow Up, Get Along and Get Stuff Done. But you have just released a second book, is that correct? The Good Fight.
Yeah, just within the week, yes.
Wonderful. So you've had your launch party, which I think you were having while we were corresponding for this show. So thank you for squeezing us in with all of what you've got going on. And also Liane is also a keynote speaker and a facilitator for big businesses, and she goes in and sorts out the conflict, or maybe not conflict, because no one wants to talk about the conflict, do they, Liane?
Yeah, much more often that I'm going in because they're not having the conflict as opposed to that they're having too much conflict. That's absolutely true.
Yeah, yeah. So I really want to get into the bones of this and really just hit the heart of it, which your book's very much focusing on, start with you and start to unravel the person so that they can see where they're holding back and where they're not dealing with being honest with themselves and their team. And that's very much what your first book was, You First, about. And The Good Fight I really want to get into as well. So the main sentence I wanted to start us off with was something you said in one of your talks was, really, when you're looking at changing how a business is, and all businesses change whether we like it or not, I'm sure you would agree, even if we sit and do nothing, the business will still change because the environment's changing. So we have to keep up. So what you've said was, when you're looking at changing how business is, you are looking at conflict, and specifically at how conflict is productive. And you've said, if we don't have enough conflict, because obviously everybody wants to be nice, but if you don't have conflict, then 1, how do we innovate? Because obviously you need that friction, grow the top line. And then 2, how do we protect the organization with the type of bravery to call at risk? So Liane, where do you start? What would you say when you're looking at this? Because this is the biggest issue. People just don't want to speak out and say the wrong words. So what do you do, Liane?
Yeah, so the first thing you need to do, so if we think about for a manager, the person in the best position to change the culture to create more productive conflict is usually a team leader. And they do it by talking about what conflict is supposed to look like on the team, by normalizing the conflict. So one of the exercises that I talk about in The Good Fight is an exercise that helps you go around to every role on the team and answer 3 questions. So the first question, what's the unique value that your role is bringing to the table? So if I'm the shipping person, I'm really focused on, okay, when do we have to get the lots to the loading bay? What do we need cold shipping for? I'm thinking about issues that way. So the first question, what's your unique value? The second question, what stakeholders are you thinking about in your role? And, in the shipping example, you're thinking about that either your internal shipping company or a partner. You're thinking about the customers and having the shipments arrive on the other side. So who are you thinking about, and who is really the stakeholder you're advocating for? And then the third question is, what's the annoying tension that your role is supposed to put on the team? So if you go through this exercise with everybody on your team, it'll be really interesting, because you'll be 2 or 3 roles in where you'll see everybody go, oh, and people will realize that if we're doing everything right, there's tension on this team. So I don't encourage people to start getting into productive conflict by just picking a fight one day. That's not going to go over well in a conflict avoidant culture. The best way to start is with a conversation about what could and should productive conflict look like on our team. What are those tensions supposed to be? And if you start there, then when an issue comes up, you will naturally know, oh, okay, it's supposed to feel like this person is tugging on me. We talked about that. So always normalizing conflict by starting with a conversation about what it could and should look like.
Yeah, because like you said, something like it's the opposing forces, but things are supposed to be opposing and pushing and pulling, because everybody has different roles, and that's the whole point. I think we as society think we're all supposed to fit and conform, but that's right. Not, is it? I mean, it's not.
Well, if everyone, there's a great quote that I really love. If everyone thinks alike, no one thinks very much. And so, no, on teams, if we needed everyone to think alike, we wouldn't need a team. So one of the things I talk a lot about is tension is not the antithesis of good teamwork. It's the purpose of good teamwork. So if we can get those ideas kind of into our heads and realize it's supposed to feel like tension. The other thing, I use the word tension really intentionally because, and that sounds like that was very punny, but I use tension on purpose because I want you to feel like it's a pull, like, oh, they're pulling me to think differently. And that's very different than the way we usually interpret someone disagreeing with us at work. Is we interpret it as friction. They're a jerk, or they don't like me, or they don't like my ideas, or I'm dumb. And friction, we all know, wears us down. Yeah. Tension makes things bigger. So we want to think about these sorts of productive conflicts as things that put tension on the conversation without bringing friction to the conversation.
Interesting. I really like that. So say a bit more. So it's, how do you get people to understand what's the difference between friction as opposed to tension, which is stretching you? How do you get them to become aware of that?
So starting with that exercise we talked about. So if I know that, if I'm in sales and all I'm trying to do is get that order recognized in this month so I can hit my target, then I'm not thinking about what's going on in the loading dock. And I'm not thinking about you trying to keep that organized and whatever. So when I say, hey, you got to ship this today, and you say, I can't ship it today, or that doesn't work, I may think, you jerk, you don't want me to get my bonus this month. I interpret it as friction. Yeah. When I have done that exercise and I understand that you're trying to get the most orderly shipping so that our costs are the lowest, so that we don't have to hire external companies to take an extra load, which costs us more, I go, oh, okay. And then maybe I have a conversation about, is there any way we could make it work because it makes a difference for my bonus? So now we're understanding that the idea of getting sales out the door as fast as possible can be in tension with having the most efficient and effective shipping. So these two things, and if I know that, then I don't think, oh, you're a jerk. Yeah. I think, oh, you're being rewarded for different things than me. Your role has to pay attention to something different than me. Yeah. So that's how you get into that dynamic where people are interpreting it as tension rather than friction. Yeah, brilliant. I love it. And so it really is just learning to think of it from the wider perspective of the other person, the other department, the other part of the business, and how do people learn? Because obviously what I do is learning it as behaviors. How do you then get them to, because it's okay to remember that while you're there and you reminding them and prodding them,
But how do you get them to consistently learn that as a behavior?
So I would say by getting it wrong a bunch of times, right? That's how we learn. If we're trying to learn how to golf, we learn we have to keep our shoulder down. And how do we learn? Well, the time we don't, and it goes hooking off into the woods, and you go, oh, that didn't work. So the same is true with behavior. If I start interpreting it as you being a jerk, what I need is some feedback, both, wow, that didn't feel good for me. I got that learning just from, how frustrated I got in the meeting, but also from seeing the reaction that comes when I start to act as if this person is, trying to annoy me intentionally. And so I always say to people, look, in the good fight, I share many, many, many tips. I get right into, here are the words you can use to say these things. And when I give keynote speeches, people often sort of put up their hand and like, what if I get it wrong? And I said, if you get it wrong, great. Because then you go, oh, I blew that. I was really trying, I know we talked about how this is what you have to think about in shipping. And I'm trying to keep that in mind. And I just got really carried away by, being upset that I wasn't going to get that sale out this month. If you blow it, just say it. And what happens in that moment is, first of all, you bring the attention of the team back to this issue that we need tension. But secondly, you earn trust. Because the person goes, oh, I'm glad you said that, because it felt pretty crappy for me when you were acting as if I was, personally trying to take you down. And so you build trust in that moment where you go, oh, I blew it. So you sustain the behavior by practicing it, by using the language associated with it, by making mistakes and correcting them. All of those things are the ways in which you start to make this a habit in your team.
And do you see this, Liane, like when you walk into that first training room, and I don't know whether it be, with the really senior guys or the middle management or the guys on the shop floor doing the stuff, but is there the friction as opposed to the tension? Exactly. They walk in, oh, right, yeah, she's here to change our behavior, like, and make it do something that we don't want to do. How do you get from there to where you're talking about where they go, oh, okay, I'll try it. Okay, so I've got to make a mistake, and it's okay to make a mistake. How do you get from there, from them to the next stage, which is willing to try? How is it just purely building that trust?
So a couple of ideas. One is fundamentally, they're tired of feeling this way. So they're tired of feeling the friction. They are worn down. And, it would be nice if we could get to the other side of the friction without them having to change their behavior and only everybody else but, most grownups understand that it's probably not going to work that way. I probably need to change something. So, that's an important piece. The second piece is I never start a conversation with the team talking about what's not working. That's too close, too personal, too much judgment. And so I always start the conversation with saying, what does our team need to be for the future? So how is the business world changing? How is what our organization's counting on us for changing? And then as we talk about the future and what the team could and should be, then you say, okay, how would we have to behave to make that happen? Yeah. And so what happens when you turn it into a forward-looking conversation is, I'm not saying what you're doing today is wrong for today. All I'm saying is, what does it need to be tomorrow? And how do we need to evolve and change to be ready for that world? So that way, psychologically, it's a much safer conversation because I'm talking about, oh, okay, well, I know. So if I talk to my daughter in high school about how she's behaving today and her study habits, she might get defensive. If I talk about, okay, next year's your final year and you want to get into this university, what would it take to get the grades you want next year? What would it have to look like? Well, then there's a lot less defensiveness. So that's another tip for dealing with any kind of behavior change among people is don't judge what they are today. That will create defensiveness. Instead, kind of inspire them for what they want to be tomorrow.
Sure, that's a really good way of detaching it from, like you say, from me, because it's not about me, it's about me in the future, which, hey, that's fine. What did you say?
I read a really interesting study last week that says that we actually, if you look at the neuroscience, the brain imaging around talking about you in the future, it actually looks exactly like we're thinking about a different person. So it actually is true. When we're thinking about us in the future, we're thinking about a different person, and it's much safer. There's a little bit of an emotional distance. So we now finally have the neuroscience for why this technique has been working for me for a long time. And that was exciting to learn.
You discovered it. Like, wow.
I just read it, but yeah, it was really exciting.
So you said when you walk in, they get detached, future, whatever. But you said they're usually fed up, or, there's that kind of,
sure,
they want to make that shift. Is that always the same, that they admit they're fed up? Because are we all good at admitting, we're maybe a bit stuck or a bit fed up?
No. But I give them the side eye, right? With some teams where it's really bad, I will start the day by saying, I want you to write on a piece of paper how you want to show up today, so that at the end of the day today, you are incredibly proud of yourself. So you know your own foibles, you know your own behavior, you know what's working for you and what's derailing you. You don't have to share this with anybody. I just want you to write on a piece of paper, what are you going to do differently today, so that at the end of the day, you're super proud of yourself. And it's amazing. I haven't used that very often, but when I use it at the end of the day, people are extremely emotional. And what you realize is they haven't felt proud of their behavior in a long time.
Wow. And again, that is so good, because that's detaching them from their emotions right there. We are so rubbish at being able to see that our emotions have us held down right in this moment. But what you're doing, again, is taking them to the end of the day to think of, okay, you're all human, and you'd all want to be able to acknowledge yourself at the end of the day, whether you're really angry at me being here, or being in this room, or being made to do this training. You all want to acknowledge yourself, because you've all got stuff that you love, and you love appreciating yourself and appreciating others for. So that's just a really, really great technique, Liane. And I, as I said at the beginning, I could talk to you for hours, because I've watched a lot of your talks online, and you are I don't know if everybody watching knows you, but you are such an amazing speaker, and so funny. Your humor is, I believe, I think it's probably a key aspect to why you have been so successful. I've known you for like.
I have to say, it's Mary Poppins, right? This work is very, very, very intense and emotional. So a spoonful of sugar does help the medicine go down, for sure.
Yeah, but you use a lot of life lessons and stuff, and the mother-in-law thing. So I don't know whether you want to mention the mother-in-law thing, and just little, and then there's the tissue issue, and then the exit sketch. So I mean, we've got about another 10 or so minutes. So
okay, let's do the mother-in-law. That's a good one. Okay. So I just forget about mother-in-law for a minute. We'll come back to that idea. But here's the thing I want everybody to think about. So I want you to think about, I had to prepare a presentation for my boss. It's really important. And maybe it's even going to my boss's boss. So I say to the boss, okay, it's ready. And the boss says, okay, send it out to your teammates to get feedback. So I send out my presentation to everyone. And the first email that comes back is from that person. The one that just like makes your skin crawl. There's been a lot of friction with this person. And you open the email and it says, I got the draft presentation. I caught a couple of mistakes. I have some ideas for how to make it better. I'll come by your desk at 3:00. And when I ask people how they feel, they'll say, angry, defensive, worried. I feel a dentist appointment coming on at 3:00. I think I'm late for my cleaning. Yeah. And so that's just what happens. It's very natural. Okay, now erase that person from your head. And now imagine that the second email is from the person on the team who you just trust implicitly. They're your best friend on the team. You absolutely, talk to them about everything. And you open the email and it says, I got the draft presentation you sent. I caught a couple of mistakes. I have a couple of ideas to make it better, and I'll come by your desk at 3:00. Well, now you're having a completely different reaction. You're relieved they caught the mistakes instead of them going to, good thing you caught those mistakes.
Yeah.
When they have some ideas, you're like, oh, they're so interested in my work. I know, it's so interesting. And at 3:00, you're refilling the candy dish on your desk. And so I call that the mother-in-law effect, because there are things that your mother could say to you that if your mother-in-law said the exact same things, you'd have a completely defensive reaction. So it turns out that's how our brains work. We take neutral information, and that email actually is quite neutral, and we pass it through the part of our brain where we keep all our baggage. And the baggage helps us decide, is the person catching mistakes friendly, or is it somebody being our enemy, friend or foe? And so you have to understand that those preconceived notions, those biases you have now about your teammates from all the baggage you've built up, they are now shaping how you see every single interaction. And so as long as you don't deal with those, as long as you leave that conflict there, what I call conflict debt with that person, where we need to resolve it, but we haven't, then you're going to keep interpreting things as friction, when perhaps those new ideas were actually tension and they were great new ideas. So that's the mother-in-law effect. It's why it's so important that we address conflict with people, because until we do, we're stuck in a vicious cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think that is so key, because you just said, change the value you bring and then change your team.
Yes.
We are done if you cannot start with a positive assumption. And
Right.
It kind of sent chills down me when I watched that yesterday, when you did that whole kind of, imagine it's the person who you hate the most, who hates you, who's always having a go at you. And then you changed it to the person you're coming out the meeting room with, and you're slapping each other on the back and having jokes and stuff. And then you read those the same way. And I was just like, I completely heard that differently when it was the pal that I sit with on the meeting, and you have the, you always got each other's back. I read that so differently, and it was the same words. And it's just like, how instrumental is that in driving teams forward and be able to deal with conflict? If we can't set that aside, and this person could have, this nasty person that we don't like, the mother-in-law, they could have something, well, not positive, but just something constructive criticism.
Yeah.
We just don't see that. We just see them as they're the person who hates me. And that's the biggest thing I've learned as a coach, is learning to step outside and go, do you know what? You're not even on their radar, and they probably don't even have a bad word to say. But just because you've got this bad chemistry, or you've made your mind up that they dislike you, you have to get that out of your head, or else we'll get nowhere in the world.
Yeah, and so it's fundamental to having a healthy team, but it's just as fundamental to having a healthy life. So you tell me, which person do you want to be? The one walking around thinking that everyone's out to get me, they think my work isn't good enough, they think I'm dumb? Or do you want to be the person walking around the world thinking, oh, they've got my back, they don't want me to make a mistake and embarrass myself, they are interested in my work and want to make it better? Which life do you want to live? Because I know which life I want to live, right? Those positive assumptions affect whether we walk around the world with that little cloud above our heads, or whether there's sunshine, right? So it's fundamental to a healthy team, but it's just as fundamental to, living a life, telling yourself a story that's got a happy ending.
Yeah. Have we got enough time, Liane? Because I wanted to go through the teams, but I'm not sure if we've got enough, because you said there's like 5 types of teams, which were really good to identify. Have we got time to identify that, or did you want to kind of touch a bit more on the good fights and just kind of how, because I said to you where I'd like to leave it and leave some people some extra value is prioritizing what we do daily about chasing the squirrel, like how do we remember all this good stuff that you've taught us? So which of those would you want to focus on?
That's a great question. So we can talk about the teams really quickly, and even if we don't cover all of them. So toxic teams go bad in so many ways. So let's cover a couple. So one is we have teams that are really obviously toxic. And so one of the teams I talk about in You First is the crisis junkie team. And this is usually a team that has a weak manager. So the manager doesn't do the work of like the exercise we were talking about. They would never do that. They don't have the courage to confront the uncomfortable topics. And so they don't get everyone aligned. And so instead of getting everyone aligned and figuring out what's most important in those sorts of things, they just wait for a crisis to make everything clear. And I actually, in the book, I'm not sure which story I tell in the book, but I worked with a team, a global shipping company that actually literally had pirates board their ship with machine guns off of Africa. And when I was talking with them afterwards, they were talking about it as, oh, that was awesome. Because then we were all clear on what the priorities were. And, there was no politics or infighting. It was like, we got to deal with this. There's pirates on the ship. So if you're a person who either literally or metaphorically needs pirates to create alignment on your team, that's a pretty toxic situation. So crisis teams.
It's excitement, right? Sorry to interrupt. It's exciting, than the normal kind of everyday.
Yeah. So yeah, it's exciting.
Exciting.
It's really what it does is it does the work of creating alignment for you and dealing with the drama and the politics. It does it for you. Then we have another team that I worry a lot about is what I call the Bobblehead team. And so, those little bobblehead dolls where you touch their head and they get nodding. And that's a team that we don't think of that as a toxic team because, I don't know, everybody looks happy. They're all nodding. They're all getting along. And it can be as toxic as anything because that's a team where groupthink can set in and we don't have enough of that tension. So we aren't spotting risks in our plans. We aren't creating innovation because everyone is thinking too similarly. So that's another really problematic team. And another toxic team that's really common these days is what I call the spectator team, which is not really a team at all. It's just a bunch of people sitting around having their one-on-ones with the boss at the same time. So you can tell you're in a spectator team when it's a conversation between the boss and you, and then it's a conversation between the boss and someone else, and there's no interplay, no interaction. And that's a team that's not going to create anything positive in terms of innovation or those sorts of things. We also have the Royal Rumble team where everybody's fighting and those sorts of things. So there's a bunch of different toxic teams, and You First takes you through all of them. And what it does in the book is it actually says, okay, if this is the kind of team you're on, it gives you ideas. If your team leader is willing to help you fix it, it tells you how to do that. It tells you, okay, what if the team leader is not on board, but your teammates are willing to help you fix it? And finally, it says, okay, even if you're going it alone, nobody else sees there's a problem. How do you start to make this better? So that's the sort of promise of You First, is that the book is full of ideas about how to fix your team, even if you're the only one who thinks there's a problem.
And then coming to the Good Fight, where then would you say that the majority of the content is then aimed at?
Yeah. So The Good Fight is a book that helps us to understand the cost to our organizations, to our teams, and to us as individuals of trying to avoid conflict all the time. And it actually demonstrates how when you try and avoid conflict, it gets worse. If you don't like being uncomfortable, it actually shows you how waiting to address an issue is going to be way more uncomfortable than if you had addressed it. So what we want is conflict that's very frequent, little tiny amounts of conflict all the time, instead of letting these things balloon. And so when I use the metaphor of conflict debt, it's because, if I was paying in cash for everything I had to buy, I wouldn't get that compounding interest and suddenly have that debilitating debt. So that's the idea there. And so The Good Fight takes you through, okay, how do I do that? How do I start to broach these sorts of things? It goes through what are the words I can say, all of those techniques. And then finally, it gets back to where we started our conversation this morning, Rachel, which is talking about how do managers start to systematize that conflict so it becomes part of the culture? How do we create a conflict habit on our teams? And if people want to check it out at leannedavey.com, there's 2 sample chapters downloadable for free right now on the website. So if they want to get a bunch of that good stuff see if it's going to be useful in their team, they can check it out on leannedavey.com right now.
That's great. So a lot of The Good Fight is making the uncomfortable become more comfortable for people.
So I always talk about it as it doesn't get more comfortable.
Right.
So, but I understand that being uncomfortable for a short period of time is going to make everything much better the rest of the time. So I use the analogy in the book of it's just like when I used to have really weak abdominal muscles. And so I'd get a sore back and I hated standing in line. So now 3 times a week, I do crunches and plank and all those horrible things. And you know what? Plank, it sucks no matter how often you do it. It just sucks. But if I do plank 3 times a week, I may be uncomfortable for 60 seconds, but the whole rest of my week is better and more comfortable, and I can stand without getting tired. So what we want people to do is not wait for conflict to become comfortable, but to actually understand that I'm okay with being uncomfortable, particularly if a little bit of discomfort creates a much, much better situation for the rest of the time.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we've done 30 minutes, but I was just looking at when you said about chasing the squirrel. Do you remember saying that bit? Because I think that's a really good thing to end on, because we read all this good stuff and people listen to you, people like you and myself, Liane, and we read some good tools, but how do we stop ourselves, going back to sort of chasing? And maybe you could just elaborate a bit what you meant by the chasing the squirrel.
I can't even remember that story. It must have been from one of those live speeches where. So chasing the squirrel is really about, you know what the day's about, you know what you're working on, and it's like if you take your dog to the park and you know where you're going, and all of a sudden there's a squirrel, and it doesn't whoosh, off you go. So we have so many squirrels in our lives these days. So really the key thing is, if you're going to start to create behavior change for yourself, pick one thing. Pick one thing that you really want to do differently. And I would say what I would love for the audience to do is to think about what's one conflict debt they're in on their team. What's one spot where the mother-in-law effect is getting them into trouble. And then do one thing this week that is going to start to change that for the better. Change your assumption about a person, tell yourself a different story. So avoiding the squirrels, we don't want people trying to fix everything at once. It's not going to work. But instead, pick the one thing that you really want to, the one relationship that's the most important to you, could make your work life so much better, and go do one thing, have one conversation that would start to pay down that conflict debt that you're in.
So great. And I just think from this 30-minute podcast, that the biggest thing that people could take away with them was that whole mother-in-law thing, to your best buddy coming out of the meeting room, is that will change your whole way that you look at people. And like you say, look at the people you think are the conflict relationships, when actually could be your best advocate within the company. So do you know what? You've got so much good stuff into this podcast, Liane, and I thank you so much for getting up early, because it's a lot earlier there in Toronto, and just for coming on, because you are awesome. You are an awesome author and speaker and consultant. And I would urge everybody, where can they go find you again, Liane?
Yeah, so just let me spell it, because the spelling's challenging. So it's lianedavey.com. So LIANEDAVEY.com. And you'll find tons of great stuff there. Those couple of sample chapters of The Good Fight are there at the moment. And then there's over 400 articles and tools. I think you also found the YouTube channel. So I have a YouTube channel, which has, I think the most popular video on the YouTube channel with 60,000 views or something is about how do I deal with my passive aggressive teammates. That's a popular one. So there's lots of places to find all the resources that I share, so that we can change ourselves for the better and change our teams for the better.
So good. Thank you very, very much again. And for our viewers out there, and we've even got our live people who haven't asked any questions, but I think they're still getting to grips with Crowdcast. But thank you again, Liane, and have an amazing day, and really good luck with The Good Fight, and may it become another New York Times bestseller.
Woo! Okay. Sounds good to me. Thanks so much, Rachel.
Thanks, everybody. Speak soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.